Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. In today's episode, we examine one of the most polarizing questions of the American Civil War. Why did Meade allow the Confederates to escape back to Virginia after their embarrassing defeat at Gettysburg? Abraham Lincoln expressed deep disappointment in General George Meade for allowing General Lee and his army to escape after Gettysburg. In an unsent letter dated July 14, 1863, Lincoln wrote that Meade failed to grasp the magnitude of the missed opportunity. He believed that Lee's army was within Meade's easy grasp, and that capturing or destroying it could have ended the war. Lincoln lamented that Meade's inaction prolonged the conflict indefinitely, describing the situation as a golden opportunity lost. Following their defeat at Gettysburg in July of 1863, General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia began a challenging retreat to Virginia. The retreat was marked by harsh weather, difficult terrain, and persisting Union pursuit. Lee's forces moved through Maryland, enduring cavalry skirmishes and raids, while transporting their wounded in a wagon train that stretched for miles. Upon reaching the Potomac River, they faced rising waters and destroyed pontoon bridges, forcing them to construct defensive positions while awaiting an opportunity to cross. Was this the opportunity Meade had been waiting for? General Robert E. Lee's march out of Pennsylvania heading to Virginia in the summer of 1863 was an arduous trek. Lee's journey back to Virginia after his defeat at the Battle of Gettysburg was fraught with numerous challenges and difficulties which tested the resilience and determination of his army. Retreating southward while being pursued by the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major General George G. Meade, the retreat began on July 4, 1863, under adverse conditions. The Confederate forces were burdened with thousands of wounded soldiers, and the logistical challenges of moving such a large and battered army was immense. One of the primary troubles Lee encountered was the weather. Heavy rains turned the roads into quagmires, making the movement of troops and artillery exceedingly difficult. The swollen Potomac River posed a significant obstacle, as the Confederates needed to cross it to reach the safety of Virginia. The river's high water levels delayed the construction of pontoon bridges, further complicating the retreat. Additionally, the Confederate army faced constant harassment from Union cavalry. Meade's forces, although criticized for not being more aggressive, managed to inflict damage on the retreating Confederates. Skirmishers and rearguard actions were frequent, adding to the strain on Lee's men. The Union cavalry's effort to cut off and capture Confederate supply trains also created logistical nightmares for Lee. The condition of Lee's army was another significant challenge. The soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and suffering from a lack of adequate supplies. The retreating army had to forage for food and supplies in the already war-torn countryside, further depleting the resources available to them. The wounded soldiers, many of them who were transported in makeshift ambulances, added to the logistical burden. Days after the Battle of Gettysburg, General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia found themselves trapped at Williamsport, Maryland, pinned between the rain-swollen Potomac River and elements of Major General George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac. Lee actually had languished there for a week, save perhaps only thanks to the tepid pursuit of Meade's drained Federals, exhausted by their hard-fought victory at Gettysburg on July 1st through the 3rd. On July 14th, Meade was finally ready to make a meaningful attack after reconnoitering the Confederate positions for 2 days. But when the Federals moved on Lee at the appointed hour, they were dismayed to discover he and his army were gone. By fashioning bridges from barn materials and fences, Confederate engineers provided the means for Lee to slip away, crossing the raging Potomac into Virginia. A frustrated Meade wrote his wife Margaretta, "I start tomorrow to run another race with Lee." President Abraham Lincoln was beyond anguished at the news, declaring, "The fruit was so ripe, so ready for plucking, that it was very hard to lose it." Already pained at Meade's slow pursuit of Lee, the president went on to express himself in terms so sharp that Meade asked to be relieved from command, a request quickly denied. After crossing the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia proceeded to Winchester, west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Meade opted not to follow Lee directly, but to move his army through the Loudoun Valley, east of the Blue Ridge. This, Meade reasoned, would allow for easier resupply by rail while keeping the pressure on the Confederate flank, forcing Lee to continue retreating south. If the opportunity presented itself, he would strike the Confederate flank through any of the ridges, many passes, and gaps. It took the Federals 3 days to get across the Potomac, forgivable perhaps, considering the troops had been marching nearly continuously since mid-June, stopping only to fight, and were thin on supplies, food, and endurance. To the men's credit, their pace increased considerably once across the river, and by July 20th, Meade had his men east of the Blue Ridge, parallel to Lee's army as he had intended. But both armies were dealing with brutal weather, stifling heat, and alternating downpours. Ahead of the main body, Federal cavalry scouted the key passes at Snickers and Ashby's Gaps, while Lee deployed infantry and artillery to Manassas and Chester Gaps, attempting to check Federal forces and prevent an attack on his retreating columns. As he approached Manassas Gap near Front Royal, Meade learned that the Confederates were directly opposite his position. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. If he threw a force through the gap and fell upon the center of Lee's battered troops, he could potentially eviscerate the Army of Northern Virginia. On July 21st through the 22nd, Union cavalry units under Colonel William Gamble and Brigadier General Wesley Merritt fought against a mixture of rebel units over possession of Chester and Manassas Gaps. Among the Confederates facing Merritt's troopers for control of the easternmost part of Manassas Gap were Companies B, the Warren Rifles, and C of the 17th Virginia Infantry. Other elements of the 17th Virginia held the road to Front Royal at the western end of the gap. This was the first time troops raised in Warren County fought on their home soil, much to the delight of the local citizenry. "Huzzah! Bless our glorious 17th," wrote Front Royal resident Lucy Buck. "How they have longed ever since the war began for a brush with the foe in the valley and near their homes. And now that wish has been gratified. They've whipped them bravely and well, and no doubt feel more exultant than they've ever felt after a miniature battle." But the 17th would soon move west out of the gap and continue south with the rest of their corps, missing the larger battle to come. Meade issued orders to new 3rd Corps commander, Major General William H. French, on July 22nd to take Manassas Gap. Through the pass ran a railroad of the same name. This east-west line connected Manassas Junction to Front Royal and Strasburg. The plan was for the 3rd Corps to lead the attack, followed by the 5th Corps, with the 2nd Corps held in reserve. To speed their movements, both attacking corps were ordered to leave their supply trains behind. Before midnight on the 22nd, all of the 3rd Corps was in position. The Corps had been wrecked during the 3-day battle at Gettysburg, but was among the leading troops pursuing the Confederates. There had been some major command changes since Gettysburg. Major General Daniel Sickles was gone, his leg the victim of a cannonball during the July 2nd fighting near Trussell Farm, and he had been replaced by French. Earlier in the war, French had served as a brigade commander. Then he had a division with the 2nd Corps, but had missed Gettysburg while garrisoning Harper's Ferry. It was these Harper's Ferry men who replenished the beat-up 3rd Corps. Brigadier General Henry Prince was the new commander of the Corps' 2nd Division and was among the oldest generals in the Army. The 2nd Division, 2nd Brigade, known as the Excelsiors, of whom much of the upcoming fighting would depend, was also under new command. Brigadier General Francis B. Spinola, a 42-year-old New York politician who had previously led only Pennsylvania militia and minor coastal operations, was now heading perhaps the Corps' most seasoned brigade. Meade intended for his army to converge on Manassas Gap and push through to Front Royal, cutting off the tail of Lee's retreating columns, while Wright's brigade, Georgia troops now under the temporary command of Colonel E.J. Walker, had been assigned to guard the flank of A.P. Hill's corps as it passed through Front Royal. At daybreak on July 23rd, the brigade's 4 regiments marched 5 miles east towards Manassas Gap. Alerted to the threat of the 3 Union Corps, the Georgians took up defensive positions on the Gap's adjacent hills and the railroad cut. Although the Yankees occupied the eastern part of the Gap, the rebels controlled the commanding high ground to the west. Early on the morning of the 23rd, French moved his 2nd and 3rd Divisions forward, and by 9 a.m. they reached the entrance to the Gap at Linden Station. A small battalion of skirmishers from the 1st Division was sent forward to field the enemy and to compel him to show his pickets on the heights as well as in the ravines. They soon found the awaiting Georgians on the high ground. This, French concluded, was a large flank guard to delay our advance. Beyond the Gap could be seen continuous columns of Lee's cavalry, infantry, artillery, and the baggage wagons, moving all day from the direction of Winchester towards Strasburg, Laurie, and Front Royal. But exactly how large did a large flank guard need to be for Corps commanders like French to modify his plans? Earlier reports of enemy movements perhaps led French to anticipate many more than just the 4 Georgian regiments detailed to face him. French obsessed all day about protection of his flanks and transmitted orders accordingly. Perhaps French did not fully divine Meade's intentions and chose to fight with the objective only of seizing Manassas Gap and leaving destruction of Lee's wagon train until the next day. About 11 a.m., the enemy appeared in the valley in our front in force, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, reported Captain C.H. Andrews of the 3rd Georgia. But for some reason, French, Old Blinky, as he was known to his men, seemed in no great hurry this day. Another 3 hours passed before the 1st Division stepped off. Andrews, meanwhile, sent urgent messages reporting a situation and requesting reinforcements. 2nd Corps Commander Lieutenant General Richard Ewell and one of his division commanders, Major General Robert Rhodes, appeared later on the field with promises of more Confederate troops. None of those arrived, however, before the Federals had swept the Georgians off the first and highest ridge, known as Wapping Heights. Wrote Andrews, the enemy's advance was very determined from the first, and after hard fighting forced the left and center of our line to retire. The 3rd Georgia, eventually isolated and unprotected on its right, reportedly did not retire until flanked. By 4 p.m., Wapping Heights was in Union hands. Though Meade had been on the scene for some time, he apparently did little to spur French on when his troops stopped to consolidate their position overlooking a second ridge upon which the retreating rebels had reformed. Colonel Walker had been wounded during the fighting on the heights, and command of his unit devolved to a staff officer, Captain Victor Gittery, who conducted the movements on the brigade's left while Andrews commanded the right. Our line now extended about 2 miles and was very weak, as our numbers were small, wrote Andrews, who had about 600 muskets flank to flank. Despite holding Wapping Heights, and with sunset expected around 7:30, French hesitated in pressing his attack against the still outmanned Georgians, preferring instead to bring up Prince's 2nd Division. After an hour's delay, the 2nd Division was in position, but many of their hungry and bored comrades in the 1st Division had begun to busy themselves during the delay by picking berries and chasing sheep. Around 5 p.m., Spinola was ordered to push his brigade forward, though absent the 120th New York and with fewer than 1,000 rifles. Moving past the men of the 1st Division and down the hill, the Excelsiors positioned themselves to lead the next attack. Halting at the base of the heights, the New Yorkers formed a line of battle as Spinola rode among the regiments, shouting encouragements as well as orders to fix bayonets, a directive that energized the brigade. We were put into a line of battle, and there told what we had to do. There were no use in telling us that, for we could see what we needed to do, wrote Private James Dean of the 72nd New York. The word was given to advance. Moving at the double quick, the brigade picked its way through a cornfield and some swampy ground, all the while under constant enemy musketry. Though slowed by a wide ditch and an enemy volley, the weight of the Federal numbers proved too much, and the Confederate line began to crumble. With a yell that would have done credit to a band of demons, our boys sprang to their feet and rushed the foe, read the 72nd New York's after-action report. With regimental colors flying in the breeze, Spinola rode ahead of his men, his sword and pistol drawn, urging them forward with, "Now, boys of the Excelsior Brigade, give 'em hell!" The New Yorkers drove the Georgians before them, swarming over rifle pits as they collected prisoners. The Excelsiors made liberal use of the bayonet as fleeing rebels discarded weapons, belts, and cartridge boxes. I know that some of them was wounded with the bayonet of our men. I do not want to brag, but I gave one of them an inch of steel myself, wrote one New Yorker to his parents. We resisted them to the utmost of human capacity, Andrews wrote, fighting till our ammunition was exhausted, and to enable us to fight at all, the ammunition was taken from the killed and wounded and distributed. Outnumbered and in disarray, the Confederates retreated, scarcely able to fire a shot in return, as the New Yorkers pursued, sometimes as close as 15 paces. While chasing the fleeing Georgians, the Excelsiors came to another small hill, roughly 200 yards to the rear of the enemy's original position. This hill had been reinforced by the men of Brigadier General Edward A. O'Neill's Alabama Brigade, who suddenly rose, Prince would write, as thick as men can stand, opening a furious fire of musketry. This fire, along with the shot and shell from a 6-gun battery that had been brought up in support, rocked the New Yorkers. Spinola received 2 wounds and was forced to relinquish command to Colonel J. Egbert Farnham of the 70th New York. Watching Confederate reinforcements move into position and uncertain of Lee's intentions as his army progressed through Front Royal, Meade began to entertain the notion the enemy was preparing to stand and fight. Though there are reasons for my considering it probable that but a small portion of his army has passed on, Meade wrote to General-in-Chief Henry Halleck that evening, I shall attack this position covering Chester Gap tomorrow at daylight. Having charged more than 3/4 of a mile across rough ground and now facing a reinforced Confederate infantry line supported by artillery, with the sun setting, the bluecoats began to falter. 3 attempts to carry the rebel lines had failed, and with the brigade more and more disorganized, a halt was ordered. According to the 72nd New York after-action report, the 1st and 2nd Heights were carried in the face of severe fire. The men, who were now completely exhausted, were ordered to hold the position. Under orders to consolidate his position, Farnham threw out strong pickets on both flanks, while the remainder of the men built breastworks from stones and fence rails. The New Yorkers hunkered down behind the earthworks, occasionally trading shots with the enemy. We were ordered to fall back to the top of a hill and laid there in line of battle while the rebels amused themselves by throwing shell at us for a time, wrote Private Dean. The famously tart-tongued Rhodes had a somewhat different opinion of the New Yorkers' attack. Union officers, he wrote, acted generally with great gallantry, but the men behaved in a most cowardly manner. A few shots from Lieutenant Colonel Thomas H. Carter's artillery and the skirmishers' fire halted them, broke them, and put a stop to the engagement. With the Excelsior Brigade settled in on the forward line, Prince methodically brought up and positioned his 1st and 3rd Brigades, all under the leisurely and somewhat ineffective fire of rebel artillery. As the division made its final disposition, preparing for a big push, darkness descended on the battlefield. Federal troops slept on their arms in line, scrounged for food as best they could, and prepared for the next morning's fight against what commanders expected to be an entrenched enemy. But while Federals readied themselves, the Georgians, and indeed the whole of Rhodes' division, made for the rear. After dark, under orders from General Ewell, we commenced our march through Front Royal, Andrews reported. After making their way across the Shenandoah River, Rhodes' men pulled up the pontoon bridges behind them before finally stopping 2 miles beyond Front Royal. The Yankees awoke to find the enemy positions vacant, with only the dead holding vigil. Men in Prince's division headed all the way to Front Royal, only to find the discarded items of an army on the move. The Excelsiors eventually marched back to the battlefield and bivouacked for the night. The march south continued the next day. What Federal commanders apparently believed was a strong line protecting the main rebel force at Front Royal proved merely a rear guard tasked with delaying the Yankees for as long as possible, seldom stronger than an undersized brigade. All the while, the bulk of Lee's army continued moving swiftly to the west. Had Meade been 1 day earlier, or Ewell a day later, Lucy Buck wrote, our gallant Stonewall Corps would have been compelled to fight 10-1 and defeated and cut off, our baggage trains lost, our pontoons captured. Thank heaven for so miraculous an escape. Meade's opportunity to cut off the tail of Lee's army and perhaps deliver him a fatal blow was gone. He had been hindered, of course, by the tentative performances of both Prince and French, but he had also been guilty of misreading the enemy's intentions and had been unable to convey a strong enough sense of urgency of the situation to his subordinates. Whether or not French or Prince realized it, they had overwhelming numbers in their favor, yet French chose to engage his division only one at a time, and Prince, even with the entire 2nd Division at his disposal, allowed only one of his brigades to be engaged during the entire fighting. While many of the men in the Excelsior Brigade took pride in their accomplishments that day, not all who witnessed the battle shared rosy assessments of their deeds, and went so far as to label the engagement Molasses Gap. A soldier in the 5th Corps who watched events from a high knoll nearby wrote that his regiment had the unique pleasure of watching the battle without being in it. Aside from providing the entertaining spectacle, the 3rd Corps didn't seem to be accomplishing anything. According to Rhodes, who would be killed the following September at the 3rd Battle of Winchester, the fight, if it be worthy by that name, took place in full view of the division, and while the conduct of our men, and of Wright's brigades particularly, was the subject of admiration, that of the enemy was decidedly puerile. Reported losses for Manassas Gap, considered by some to have been the last battle of the Gettysburg campaign, were about 170 killed, wounded, and missing among the Confederates, the bulk coming from Wright's brigade. Federal losses were roughly 130, with the vast majority suffered by the Excelsiors. On July 24th, Meade withdrew his men from Manassas Gap and, as portrayed in Harper's Weekly, marched leisurely on toward the Rappahannock. He would have precious few chances to get the twist on Lee as nicely as the situation at Manassas Gap had offered. That November, Meade launched the entire Army of the Potomac into an unsuspecting and dispersed enemy near Mine Run, Virginia, only to have his plans unravel at the hands of French and his Third Corps subordinate, Henry Prince. The following March, the Third Corps was dissolved and its regiments reassigned throughout the army. That rid Meade of the ineffective French and Prince, both relegated to sit out the remainder of the war in backwater postings far away from the action. Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all of the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.